Hey everyone, Cool Kid here. Just over a year ago now, Warframe saw the release of one of its most divisive playable characters, Koumei. I bet you didn't even wish her a happy birthday. Because she's not real. On release, discussion about Koumei was so caustic that it could liquefy a Lancer, but now that we have a year of distance from her launch, I want to give her another look. I know people have a lot of opinions on this subject, and I want to ask those of you who choose to comment to please not repeat the catastrophe of Koumei's initial release. I also want to say that this video will assume you know how Koumei works on a basic level, so I won't waste time explaining her kit or anything like that. So then, you read the title, what exactly is the Koumei problem? Well, I want to start this video with my most controversial take. Oatmeal raisin is my favorite kind of cookie. Alright, now on to my second most controversial take. I like Koumei, a lot actually. I'm the kind of person who gets bored pretty easily, and Koumei's decree challenges keep me engaged in longer missions that normally have me passing out about 10 minutes in. I don't main her by any means, but the year she released, she was my fourth most played frame, which is especially impressive when you realize she dropped in October. I do have some problems with her design, and I'll talk about those closer to the end of the video, but they're ultimately nitpicks more than anything. So if my problem isn't really with Koumei herself, then what actually is the Koumei problem? Well, it has to do with how she's positioned as a new player frame. You see, Koumei is obtainable extremely early, being farmable as soon as the player completes both Once Awake and Saya's Vigil. She even has a reduced crafting time of 24 hours on top of cheap resource requirements. It really feels like the game is pushing players to get Koumei early on, and it's very realistic she might be a player's second ever Warframe. Okay, so why am I bitching about a frame being easy to get? Well, that's not really the problem. I'm happy if a frame is easy to grind, but I don't feel like Koumei should be pushed to new players this early. The reason why I think this is complicated, so let's break it down. The first reason is probably fairly obvious. She is way too complicated for most new players to understand. Most of her abilities don't have any immediately obvious benefit, and pretty much all of them leverage mechanics that are way beyond the understanding of new players. For example, Koumei's first and fourth abilities inflict random status effects on enemies they hit. The thing is, new players aren't going to know what these status effects do, so the benefit of any specific status proccing isn't going to be clear to them. New players also aren't going to have mods like Condition Overload to take advantage of priming, which is one of Koumei's strongest elements in the late game. Honestly, at this level, new players aren't even going to need access to priming if you ask me. It becomes much more relevant at the Steel Path level, especially because you gain access to galvanized mods that put Condition Overload's effect on your guns. Koumei's passive is kind of in a similar boat here. The status effects don't provide a clear benefit to a newer player, and priming isn't going to be relevant this early on. Funnily enough though, Koumei's passive has a weird issue for new players that isn't even really Koumei's fault. Early on, melee is by far the most dominant weapon category because of stance mods and their multipliers. I recently played through the game's entire main story from scratch on stream, and even after all these years, there is still a huge gap in strength between melees and guns at the start. The multipliers from stance mods make melee so much stronger than other weapons for so little investment that holding E is gonna be the strat for a lot of the game. I'm not saying that new players can't use their guns or anything like that, but every friend I've introduced to this game goes all in on melee once they realize how strong it is. Because Koumei's passive rotates between all her weapons, it can easily be the case that a new player isn't really using the passive 2/3 of the time because they're reliant on their melee. Again, this really isn't the fault of Koumei's passive, and I actually think her passive is an easy S tier if I were to rank it, but it's just not that useful at this stage of the game. Another ability that plays well into more advanced mechanics is Koumei's 3, Omamori. Omamori's charms have a 50% chance on hit to convert the damage into health and shields before going on a 3-second cooldown. Important thing to note here, the cooldown just means it can't consume a charm to convert the damage to health, but the 50% chance to negate damage is active so long as the ability is up. A big part of this ability's effectiveness, in my opinion at least, is its ability to instantly recharge your shield gate. Having your shield break just for Omamori to immediately refill it is super useful, especially because Koumei's base shields make her a phenomenal shield gater. But again, new players aren't going to be playing around shield gating. A lot of the mods that make this effective, like catalyzing shields for example, probably aren't going to be in the toolkit of a newer player, and the benefits of them aren't going to be very clear. On the surface, this ability just seems like an inconsistent damage reduction ability, which doesn't provide a lot of clear benefit up front. Not to mention that Koumei's efficiency decrees make shield gating very different on her than most of the cast, so conventional wisdom regarding the strategy falls flat. Speaking of decrees, let's look at Koumei's 2, Omakuji. This ability is the star that the rest of her kit orbits, a random challenge that, on completion, grants her a random decree from a limited pool. This ability is a large part of what makes Koumei such a powerhouse, but it comes with two major limitations. You have no control over what decree you actually get, and lengthy cooldowns mean that, past your first few decrees, it can be a long wait to get more. The release of the Omakuji's Fortune Augment helped to offset this, but that ignores the real problem this ability presents. New players shouldn't be sitting in an endless mission for an extended period of time. Now, I'm not saying that they can't do that. If you find something fun, don't let me stop you. But early on, the number one goal of most players will be completing the game's story, which requires them to play through several missions quickly. Koumei is by no means useless in these shorter missions, but because she can't build up her decrees like in longer missions, she's significantly weaker in the environment that new players will most often find themselves in. The last thing I want to talk about in regards to this subject has nothing to do with Koumei's abilities, but rather how you mod her. You see, Koumei is very different to build compared to most of the cast because certain stats mean very little to her. Despite being a caster frame, her several efficiency decrees make modding for efficiency kind of meaningless because it will inevitably become a dead mod slot. Strength is also very unimportant on Koumei, as it only affects the pitiful damage of her 1, the damage conversion multiplier of her 3, and the also pitiful initial damage of her 4. Range is helpful on Koumei, but only really for her 4, and it can actually be a negative for her first ability. Kumihimo can only spawn up to 24 threads, which manifest around this little star she shoots out. The range the star can travel increases with range mods, but the number of threads it can spawn is fixed, so the ability can just run away if you weren't careful. Duration is also helpful for Koumei, but only really for her first and fourth ability. So much of her kit is reliant on decrees and the 666 mechanic that ability stats don't mean as much on her. Some might argue that's actually a good thing. The mods a new player has access to won't matter as much for this frame. But personally, I'd argue it's a problem. Koumei's ability stats are so rigid that building her won't feel very impactful for newer players because they won't be able to affect her abilities that much. This quirk of Koumei's mod screen opens up cool opportunities in the late game, but she's so different from everyone else that it can be hard for a newer player to grasp. Then again, so many new players don't engage with modding at all that maybe I'm wrong on this one. Okay, I know I've been yapping for quite a bit about this, so let me sum up my thoughts. Koumei is a Warframe designed for the endgame, but given to players at the outset. She has a lot of intricacies that veteran players can take advantage of and appreciate, and she excels in missions with long runtimes, but new players can't leverage either of those things very well, if at all. Just to put this into perspective, I want to compare her to another frame who's positioned very early, Rhino. Like Koumei, Rhino is a strong candidate for second ever Warframe, being obtained from the Jackal boss on Venus. His crafting time is also 24 hours, and his resource requirements are similarly cheap. The thing is, all of Rhino's abilities provide an immediate and obvious benefit even for new players, being simple to understand out of the gate and useful enough to always be relevant. Let me explain. Rhino's 1 is a mobility tool. You can use it to move around and dash through enemies while dealing damage, and consecutive casts make it deal more damage, cost less energy, and go farther. Rhino's 2 is an extra layer of health that makes you status immune, knockdown immune, and damage immune, so long as you don't fall off the map or something. Rhino's 3 is a buff applied to himself and nearby allies that increases the damage of his weapons and abilities. Lastly, Rhino's 4 is a radial source of hard crowd control, stopping enemies in their tracks. As you can see, all of Rhino's abilities have obvious benefits that are applicable to a wide variety of mission types. He can excel in any environment because his abilities are good off the rip and easy to understand. Contrast that with Koumei, whose utility is fairly opaque to new players and primarily applicable in longer mission runs. Rhino also has the benefit of being a frame who's easy to learn but hard to master, with so much interesting minutia to his game that keeps him relevant no matter where you are in Warframe. As a player progresses with him, they'll pick up on more advanced tactics, like using Jade Light Beams to charge up Iron Skin, or leveraging the Universal Faction damage buff from Roar to beef up DOT builds. I don't mean to glaze Rhino so much in a video about Koumei, but even if I'm sounding like Amalistic's alt account, I hope my point here is clear. If a player really likes Rhino, there is no point in the game where he's not helpful, whereas Koumei excels in a specific context that's usually found in the late game. I know that comparing Koumei to Rhino is kind of apples to oranges, and I'm not trying to argue they have similar playstyles at all. The point I'm trying to illustrate is that Rhino is a very good example of a new player-oriented frame, while Koumei just isn't. She's at her best when you want to do an hour of Fisher Conjunction survival, and she is exceptionally good there, but that's not a thing new players are or even should be doing. Contrast that with Rhino, who's both straightforward and good in 99% of situations, and hopefully it's clear why I think Koumei is just not a good early game pick. Now, do I think that Koumei being easy to get is a bad thing? Hell no, and furthermore, I think that 24-hour craft times should just be the standard. But should new players be encouraged to obtain Koumei early? Probably not, no. I don't really know if this is a big enough problem that it even needs to be solved if I'm honest. It's just a thought I've had rolling around in my head since Koumei's release. Unfortunately for all of you, I've decided to vocalize that thought, so sorry about that. Now, I have one more little thing I want to bring up that's tangentially related to Koumei. This revolves around Higasa and Amanata, her signature weapons. Because they're considered early game weapons, they both have pretty mediocre base stats out of the box, but once you've unlocked the Steel Path, you'll be able to purchase their unique augment mods, Higasa Serration and Amanata Pressure. This is honestly a really neat idea, giving these weapons unique souped-up versions of common base damage mods to offset their normally low base damage, but it comes with an annoying side effect. Because the base damage of both of these weapons is rather low, base damage mods and arcanes aren't very effective on either of them, especially Higasa. This means that Koumei's priming abilities aren't that useful for either of her signature weapons because their base damage is so low that stacking base damage bonuses isn't really that helpful. I do still like both of these weapons and use them pretty often. The gun shield element of Higasa is especially cool, but I find it kind of weird how their low base damage gives their ability to synergize with all of Koumei's status effects. Okay, so the main point of the video is over now, but I still have thoughts about some peripheral topics I want to get out there. The main one revolves around the discourse that surrounded Koumei at the time of her release and how genuinely awful it was. I've seen divisive Warframes get dropped in my 11 years playing this game, but I don't think I've ever seen something like Koumei before or since. People in the pro-Koumei camp would often say that people who didn't like her just didn't get it, which honestly isn't entirely unfair. People in the anti-Koumei camp would say that people who like her don't understand basic kit design and are just coping, which is quite the response. I still see people call her things like cope mid to this day, and expressing the opinion that you actually enjoy this Warframe is bound to get at least a few responses about how you're wrong and she's objectively bad. I don't doubt I'll even get comments about this subject underneath this video from people who haven't even watched it. I don't really have a point to this section if I'm honest, I'm just kind of reflecting on how ridiculous this stuff was and, to some extent, still is. People get bullied for playing characters in any video game, unfortunately, but the level of toxicity I've seen about Koumei has been on another level. I do hope that after a whole year, people's fiery stances on this topic have died down, but I'm honestly not too sure. I also want to clarify that I'm not saying you can't dislike Koumei. You can play whoever you want, but it isn't fair to say people who main a certain frame are stupid or clueless or anything like that. Okay, now we're on to the last section of the video, a reflection on Koumei herself, removed from the context of how early you can get her. I said earlier that I enjoy Koumei because she makes endless runs much more fun and interesting, and I still stand by that, but there are a few things about her I would change. The biggest thing for me is her fourth ability. It really should open enemies to ground finishers. I find it weird that Koumei has several decrees that rely on finisher kills, but nothing in her kit opens enemies to them. No, I'm sorry Nova, I don't think Void Slinging counts as part of her kit. I'm gonna have to disagree with you on that one. If an enemy who isn't open to a finisher is caught in her 4, they actually can't be open to finishers at all, which is really annoying. This isn't a catastrophic issue by any means. Stuff like Void Sling and Slide Kicks can be used to get those finisher decrees off, but I think she'd be much more comfortable if her 4 just made enemies finisher vulnerable innately. The second major change I'd make involves her first ability. While the orb is in transit, the threads will inflict status effects on enemies that touch them, but after things become stationary, then enemies have to actually walk through the threads to trigger their status effects. If an enemy is caught in Bunraku, then Kumihimo is only good for its contact status, which I'm not a huge fan of personally. I'd make it so that if an enemy was caught in Bunraku, the nearest Kumihimo thread would link to them and start triggering its status effect repeatedly. This is by no means needed, it's honestly kind of a nitpick, but I've always found it really weird that these two abilities don't really synergize with each other that much. The last nitpick I have is that basically no ability stats affect Koumei's too. I think it could be neat if strength increased the odds of the player getting a rare decree, and duration affected how long the cooldowns were. Again, this isn't really needed, especially since the addition of Omakuji's Fortune, but I find it weird that Koumei's main ability isn't affected by almost any ability stat mods. Also, while we're talking about decrees, can Stormcaller and Grim Arsenal be changed? For those who don't know, Stormcaller gives you a damage bonus based on how many bullets you were missing from your magazine when you reloaded. Issue is, Grim Arsenal can reload your gun on kills, which will then gimp your Stormcaller bonus. I think that Stormcaller should be tweaked so that it only rerolls the bonus when you manually reload, because as it stands, if you have both of these decrees, then Grim Arsenal will stomp Stormcaller out of existence. Oh, also, can we please give Koumei access to Fearsome Bonanza and Close Contagion? I know it would be horribly unbalanced, but it would also be really funny. Alright, that's all the thoughts I wanted to get out regarding Koumei. Her position as an early game frame, the discourse surrounding her, and some changes I'd make if I was anything more than a C-list YouTuber. I know this video has been very different from the stuff I normally post, so let me know if you all enjoyed it. I have a lot of random topics like this that I could just yap about for 20 minutes, so if there's any interest, I'm down to do more. Beyond all that though, like and sub if you enjoyed, dislike if you want me to be used as a blast test dummy, and join the Discord if you've been feeling a little too sane lately. Thank you so much for watching, and a huge thank you to all of my channel members for helping to make this content possible. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I'll see you all next time when I eat 3 pounds of grapes live on stream.